Um, Good evening, everyone. I'm Shilpa Vijay Krishnan, and I head the Education and Outreach Programming at the Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore. On behalf of MAP and the Bangalore International Center, thank you for joining us today for How the Horse Shaped India, mapping the diverse historical experiences of the horse with Yashaswini Chandra, Anirudh Kaniseti, and Hasnain Mirza. Today's event marks, in effect, the Bangalore launch of Yashaswini Chandra's book, The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on Horseback, published by Pan Macmillan. In the book, Yashaswini notes how she meant originally to write this book for horse lovers, but how really the horse has been central to human civilization and that its histories are for everyone. From their role in transport, hunting, and war to their significance as symbols of prestige and wealth, this is certainly true. Yet, perhaps there has been no comprehensive survey of their role in Indian history before. We at MAP are very excited to have played a small role by opening up our archives in the making of this pioneering book, in which Yashaswini considers an impressive range of sources, delving into epics and folk songs, manuscript paintings, and equestrian manuals alike, to bring to us a gripping tale that is as much about us as it is about horses. Having started reading my copy of the book, I've certainly found it to be a bit of a dark horse in this respect, and I urge those of you who haven't already gotten one to get a copy for yourselves soon. A quick introduction to our speakers for the evening. Um, Yashaswini Chandra is an art historian, writer, and avid horsewoman. She has taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and at the Ashoka University as well. She was with Sahapedia, an open online resource on the arts, cultures, and histories of India for many years, managing the multi-volume documentation of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Anirudh Kaniseti is a researcher and writer whose work straddles technology, geopolitics, and history. He is the host of two podcasts, um, one Indian history, Echoes of India and Yuddha, and All Things Policy. For his podcasts and his work on history communication on social media, he has received the New Indian Express 2020 edition of the 40 Under 40 Award. Hasnain Mirza is a veterinarian with nearly 40 years of experience in working with horses. After graduating from the Mysore Veterinary College, Bangalore, he worked on the Kailahan Stud Farm and is a consultant to many owners, trainers, stud farms, as well as the Royal Calcutta Turf Club. Also, a quick thank you to our ISL interpreter for the evening, Manisha Sharma, for those of you who are watching online. I'd also encourage the audience watching online to address any questions they have via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The panelists will take questions towards the end of the event. So without taking more time, I'm just going to hand over to Anirudh to kick us off for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Shilpa. And thank you all for joining us this evening to talk about how the horse shaped India. Yashaswini Chandra's Tale of the Horse is an absolutely fascinating book. As Shilpa said, it's one that traces out the interweaving of the history of the horse with ours. And it's not, the horse is not a creature that is very often associated with India's history in such a deep and fundamental way as Dr. Chandra traces out. It's a book that's, in more senses than one, globe trotting. It stretches out from Multan to Malegaon. It unweaves this magnificent tapestry of networks of people, cultures, ethnicities, languages, and most importantly, horses. It's also, as Shilpa mentioned earlier, a book that also straddles many disciplines. It weaves together art, oral history, and texts to uncover the picture of this magnificent animal and how it shaped India in very fundamental ways. To begin this conversation, which is going to cover a whole bunch of different topics, from the Rajputs to the British to the Afghans and everything in between, can you tell us a little bit, Yashaswini, about how you really went about approaching a project as expansive as this? What kind of research goes into recreating a history like this?
Thank you, Anirudh, for giving the book a careful read and for summing it up so beautifully. I'm also very grateful to Hasnain for being part of this conversation. Besides being a veterinarian par excellence to my horse, He's been the equine expert that I've turned to make sense of a lot of historical information pertaining to horse care and management. I'm delighted to be here. I've been in Bangalore since the last 1 month riding and being around horses. And so I'm very pleased to be doing this event here at the Bangalore International Center, and I'm very grateful to them for hosting us. And to MAP, which has been one of the go-to collections through the course of my research. So I'm very pleased that they are collaborating on this event. So to answer your question, yes, I wanted to write a total history surrounding the horse. That also had elements of ecological, naturally it would have elements of ecological history, political, social, art histories. I wanted just to be able to demonstrate the extent to which horses shaped our history, across folklore, art, literature, mythology. And to do that, I had to undertake interdisciplinary research. And I didn't want to write the horse is an elite animal. It has been associated with status, prestige, but I didn't want to write a purely elitist history of the horse because that does not reflect the full extent of the horse's influence. So, apart from looking at sources like court chronicles, for example, in the case of Rajasthan, I knew that I would find the histories of other groups in oral traditions. And of course, paintings, I'm an art historian, so in any case, I was inclined towards that side. But to me, paintings really seem to encapsulate the story of the horse in India. And which is why I wanted to begin with my cover, because it is quite symbolic. I mean, for the front cover, it is intended to reflect the all-encompassing experience of the horse. On the front image is the iconic painting by Nansuk, the Pahadi painting of Mia Mukundev of Jasrota Prince, and others on a leisurely ride. This painting is quite well known, but to me, what was particularly extraordinary is, first of all, the horses enable the leisurely ride. So this is an aspect of horse culture that we don't normally think in terms of. We think in terms of war horses, we think in terms of trade, we think in terms of a kingly symbol, but here the horse is enabling a leisure, and leisure and pleasure. And moreover, if the prince is at the center of the painting, there's also a woman on horseback, a musician, a court performer called Amal, a couple of musicians on the horses in front, one of them playing the kettle drums, then a group of an entourage of noblemen. In the distance, in the wonderfully smoky distance, you can see some huntsmen with these miniature figures with hunting dogs and hawks. So, and there's a hookah bearer. So it's representative. It's representative that the experience of the horse was not just restricted to riders, but in this case also the servant class, right? And for the back cover, I chose this painting by Bhakta, another master artist from Devgarh in Rajasthan, because it features, first of all, the horse. The horse is very much the central character in the painting, and it represents the extent to which horses were characters. Portraits were made of horses. The name of the horse is given in the painting. Moreover, the horse is led by a groom, right? So it's not just the elite riders that I'm concerned with, but I'm also concerned with people who looked after these animals and who also contributed to the age of the horse, the pre-mechanization era, where horse shaped warfare, transportation, mobility, status, so many different aspects. And like I said, the art historical sources were very important. The point of, again, equestrian portraits at dime a dozen. So it's, they're dime a dozen. So, it's easy to miss some crucial elements that they stand for. Like there's this painting of Maharana Amar Singh of the second of Udaipur, Mewar, riding a Jodhpur horse. Now, even visually, the horse is very much at the center of the painting, right? The brightest color, the densest stippling has been reserved for the horse. So, and it is identified as a horse from Jodhpur. So, and so much so that The horse is central even in a painting featuring one of the most, featuring the foremost Rajput ruler. And the social hierarchy that I was talking about, by which, the social hierarchy, the elitism that extends to the animal, by which the horse is larger than life, whereas the groom is a diminutive figure, right? Is also reflected in such equestrian portrait in which the entourage consisting of all these fly whisk bearers and hookah bearers and royal insignia bearers, they are small figures. They appear small and stunted compared to the horse and the rider. So it's as if the horse and the rider are lending each other stature. Now, in Rajasthani painting, the Rajput lord tends to be literally the biggest person on the scene in the painting, but the horse is very much part of it. It is part of the deportment of these Rajput rulers. And these are two paintings, just to illustrate that point a little bit further. These are two paintings actually from the collection of Map. And this format, the equestrian portrait, it becomes a standardized format. So you have these, these lordly Rajput rulers, haloed with, on an ornamented horse, with these little people literally surrounding them. It's a reflection of the social hierarchy. And, like I said, recovering their histories is that much harder. But it's worth doing, because unless you don't do that, you do not reveal the extent to which the horse shaped India, how influential, even how social identities were formed around the horse. Then, similarly, what becomes a standard image is like the Thakur, the nobleman, a much more simplified way in comparison with equestrian portraits of rulers on horseback. So it becomes a status symbols, and the nobility also aspires to that kind of uh, aspires to be picturized in the same way. But that the person, the attendant accompanying the Thakur is similarly sort of much smaller than the horse and the rider. Then, so I was talking about like some of the information that you could only get it from paintings. So there are lots of references to actual horses, individual horses, to the bond between individual horse owners and their animals. But then there are also representations that belong only in images. Like, for example, Shah Jahan, the Mughal emperor, chose again and again to be represented on one particular piebald. So, like, and there are at least about, I think there are about a dozen paintings of Shah Jahan on this piebald. There are not very many textual references, but there, I mean, apart from references to frequent gifts of piebald horses from Bengal being made to Shah Jahan, suggesting that perhaps he had a weakness for these kind of horses. But he chose to be represented on the same kind of horse, if not the same horse again and again. The horse became part of not just his equestrian iconography as an emperor, but even the vision of him as a sacred king. In the second painting, you can see how he's very much picturized. He's very much depicted as a sacred king. He's haloed. There are 4 cherubs that herald him from the skies. They sort of bestow upon him the royal insignia. One of them gives him a European style crown, right? And just like, yeah, here, another example of the piebald. And if you notice in the first painting, the patterning is very distinctive, so much so that there's that fine splattering of spots on the neck of the horse. Yeah. And just like this horse appears only in paintings, its origins also are to be found in paintings, because there is this painting from the Padshah Nama, the chronicle of Shah Jahan's rule, in which he's receiving the Iranian ambassador. And now there was a great taste for Arab Persian horses in Mughal circles, and large numbers of these very prestigious horses were imported to India and bought up by the Mughal court. The Iranian king also used to make frequent gifts of Arab Persian horses to Mughal emperors. And in this case, you have the Iranian ambassador making gifts of horses. And if you see right in front, there's the piebald. There's a piebald horse, you know. So it's quite possible that before the image of Shah Jahan mounted on the piebald horse becomes a stock image, it was it was based on an actual gift of a horse, right? And this is the story of this particular horse is found only in paintings. Yeah. Then again, the references to horsewomanship, historical references to horsewomanship are limited. But there is this wonderful historical painting from the Akbarnama of Akbar receiving his mother. And you can see that in a corner, a number of female servants of the Mughal empress are depicted on horseback, covered from head to toe. You know, so in order so that they may ride out in be seen in open. And this painting is comparable to descriptions by European visitors about the the processions in which Mughal courtly women moved. There is also this wonderful representation. There's also a wonderful depiction by Fanny Parks, a British Memsahib who was traveling through India and who encountered all these Maratha princesses. And she observed the circumstances under which elite women such as her, such as them, in spite of being secluded, in spite of having to observe parda, used to ride, right? And Rani Jhansi, of course, was legendary, and it becomes a stock image so much so that it becomes a textile label, right? So you do have these kind of references to women practicing horsewomanship. Paintings such as this, they tend to be very idealized. Again, they tend to be stock images. You see, just as you find paintings of women smoking the hookah or awaiting sort of languishing on a balcony awaiting a lover, or practicing activities, female activities within the zenana. You also find very intriguing paintings of women. This is from the Rajput courts. You find very interesting paintings of women, bearing arms, hunting on horseback, astride on horseback, and like these are idealized paintings celebrating female beauty, female activities. They become stock images, but they also give us insights into the circumstances under which women practiced equestrianism, right? And it's very interesting because unlike European women who used to ride side saddle, in India, women always rode astride. And it's only women of a bet, according to Peter Mundi, a European traveler, it's only women of a certain class who rode horses. Women of lower classes tended to sit astride on oxen and ride oxen.
What I find a little surprising is that the courtesan that you see on the cover of the book is very evidently riding in the open
Yeah.
with her face uncovered.
Yeah.
Whereas the last few paintings that we've seen of courtly women,
Yeah.
are of them usually shielded in some way from the public eye.
Yeah, that is interesting. Because normally, you're right. That is actually very interesting because here she's surrounded by a number of male men, right? Not just the man that she's associated with, not just her husband or her master. Whereas more usually when women are represented on horseback, they're either in the company, they're either veiled or they are come in the company of women only, as in the case of this painting, or they are accompanied only by their husband or master. So yeah, that's unusual, and maybe that has to do with class. Women of courtesans or court performers, women of a lower class and status had more freedom to ride in public. There is this one story of a Rajput a noble woman, who, after her husband's death, took over the running of the estate, and who, dressed as a man, would appear in public, right? And ultimately, she was killed, which is unfortunate, perhaps for like overstepping these boundaries. Um, but yeah, references to women riding in public, especially elite women, legitimate wives, is not something that we hear of very often. Yeah, like this, for example, there are all these paintings of women playing polo. And in all these paintings from Jodhpur, Marwar, and Rajasthan of women playing polo, the women are always in the company of the Maharaja, right? Suggesting that these, like I said, the whole notion of leisure and pleasure surrounding a horse. So equestrian activities were part of that. Playing polo, in which women played these friendly matches with the Maharaja, was something that used to happen. But what is very interesting in this painting is the women are dressed quite similar to the Maharaja. So again, that illusion of women having to assume a masculine manner, masculine attire, to be able to sit astride on a horse and appear in the open. Yeah, then there's a class of literature called the Shalihotra or Ashvashastra literature, and it's a very diffuse tradition because numerous manuscripts over the centuries were produced in different languages, and there doesn't seem to have been a standard text or like a foundational text, right? And it's full of all kinds of well, it sounds a bit bizarre because it's all full of the notion of auspicious and inauspicious horses, and the different castes of horses. So there's the upper caste horse that smells in a certain way, the Brahman horse that smells of flowers, the Kshatriya horse that smells of, I don't know, goat. Then the Shudra horse that smells of mud or fish or something of that sort. So the hierarchy, social hierarchy is extended also to animals, and to that extent, the horses are intended to be humanized. There's also this preoccupation with auspicious and inauspicious horses. So the auspicious and inauspicious characteristics, colors, markings of horses. And this is also something that you find visual representations of it. In the case of the illustration from one Shalihotra manuscript, you see the different worlds of a horse, the different worlds that might render a horse inauspicious and bring doom upon its rider are marked. Then there was a great taste for piebald and skewbald horses. The piebald horse being of the sort that Shah Jahan was shown is depicted on, and that is represented. Then again, the portraits of horses and portraits highlighting certain qualities of that horse. In this case, this painting from Map of this horse called Masmi Kusum. First of all, a painting is made of a horse alone. The name of the horse is given. Second of all, perhaps the name suggests that it was an ash-colored horse. Now, you find instances when in the Shalihotra tradition, an ash-colored horse is supposed to be inauspicious. But then here, the horse is being valorized. It's being highlighted for its coloring. Okay, and then you wonder because a lot of this, like I said, a lot of the information that you find in the Shalihotra tradition doesn't make a lot of sense, because there's stuff like if the horse defecates on the battlefield, then I don't know, doom will befall the master. Or if the horse has 6 auspicious worlds, then the master will be blessed with the sun. That kind of stuff. So it's very difficult to tell what purpose these manuscripts, this literature played, until you find a painting such as this, in which you understand that they were a part of this culture of connoisseurship that surrounded horses. And it was required of these warrior elite men to be knowledgeable about horse flesh and also to be well versed with horse lore. So I think that's it. That was just to give you an indication of the kind of sources I've used and how art historical sources have been very important to the research.
That is just so fascinating. There's so much that we could potentially get into. One thing that really struck me is that the horse is not just an elite animal. It's the influence of the horse is felt across every section of society. It's you talk later in your book about how, for example, tribal peoples began to be used as grooms for horses, for example. And another thing that I found really fascinating about the book was the detective work that went into figuring out what Shah Jahan's favorite horse may have been. That could really not have been done with any other source except for art historical materials. And it's also quite impressive how much can be gleaned from these materials as well. There's just so much you can tell that isn't explicitly said in text, that isn't explicitly even said in the artwork, but can be gleaned by looking at patterns across many different pieces of art. So thank you for that, Yashaswini. So let's now talk a little bit about how on earth all these horses really got to India. Very evidently, what we saw a little earlier was that kings were exchanging horses. So you do have them being used almost as diplomatic tools. But you also see elites who believe that purchasing particular kinds of horses is a sign of connoisseurship and is also going to influence their social status in some way. That implies, of course, sorry? Bring luck to them, yes. That is perhaps the oddest thing about this
It's
whole.
still prevalent. Horsey people can be very superstitious.
I'm sure we will. Um, so what that obviously implies is that if these elites were able to exhibit their connoisseurship, that obviously you had many different varieties of horses, very large numbers of horses from many different parts of the world that they could potentially choose from to purchase. And this brings me to my second question, and that is, what were the networks of exchange that brought horses to India? Where do we see them coming from? Who are the people who are involved in this horse trade?
So until the 18th century, not enough horses were bred in India. And you can imagine that the demand for horse would have been tremendous in the age of warfare, in the age of cavalry warfare. There was also an elitist preference for foreign imported horses, and there were three, two major, one minor source, or perhaps three equally important sources from which horses were imported to India. One is from Central Asia, all the way from the Eurasian steppes, the Central Asian heartland, into India. From across the sea, from the Arabian Peninsula, from about the 10th, 11th century, and from Tibet through what is now northeast India and the eastern Himalayas, And so these were the three major sources. If I were to quote the statistics, you might get a sense of the magnitude. For example, 30 to 100,000 horses were imported into India from 30,000 to 100,000 horses were imported into India in about the 17th century, right? You'll get a sense of the magnitude, but you will not get a sense of the enormity of experience that the horses underwent. And it obviously had a tremendous impact. That kind of trade had a tremendous impact on shaping policy, in shaping diplomatic relationships, because, and like a lot of people migrated, a lot of horse traders migrated in the wake of all this trade, and they settled in India, so they also had a tremendous influence on Indian society and culture. So I'll just show some, right, like just to give you an example, the Mughals, the Delhi Sultanate, one of the reasons the Delhi Sultanate emerged supreme is because they took a strategic decision to hoard the supplies of horses and elephants, of animals. The Mughals had no qualms about the even distribution of horses across India. Obviously, most of the horses that entered through Central Asia would get snapped up in North India before some managed to filter into the South. And similarly, a lot of horses that that arrived at the ports of South India, of the Indian Peninsula, would get consumed would get used up within South India. But the Mughals in particular forged all these trade links with the Islamic rulers of Iran, of Central Asia, and that did a lot to further enhance this trade in horses. And it was so tremendous that it did have an impact on even the landscape of North India. There are all these fantastic caravanserais, the ruins of many of which remain along the Grand Trunk Route, which was the arterial road around which a network of roads developed that effectively connected Mughal India. Right? And you have these caravanserais, and there are very evocative descriptions of horses being, stabled in the courtyard So these caravanserais would basically consist of a quadrangle with rows of with rows of cells and a very vast courtyards. And there are very evocative description about horses being stabled, being parked in the courtyard. And caravanserais became such an important project of the Mughal Empire that not only were emperors and nobility building them, but a lot of women also started building them. It became a means for them to make a mark and leave a legacy, right? The trade in Central Asian horses, the caravan trade by which horses were imported from Central Asia, was in the hands of all these Afghan horse traders. And there were rounds and rounds of migration by Afghans, leading to the rise of a class of Indo-Afghans. And such was their clout as horse traders that many of them rose to tremendous power. They gained land, they gained social status. The Lodi dynasties, Sher Shah Suri, they were all descended from horse traders.
There's such a beautiful painting. You can almost imagine these as the face of actual people that you could see today, except they're wearing 19th century costume. That's me.
I mean, there is a slight, they're slightly romanticized because this is like a colonial period painting, and the Afghans were seen as these sort of very wild, romantic figures. At the same time, the British were also very suspicious of them. The same mobility that lent them so much allure also made the British very nervous. And through the colonial period, horse traders in general, Afghan horse traders and also Arab Iranian horse traders from um, were viewed by a lot of suspicion. Coming to India were viewed by a lot of suspicion by the colonial officials, and that is one of the reasons why this tremendous international trade went into a decline. Then similarly, these horses, there were these epic journeys by which all these ships cramped with horses arrived on the South Indian ports. And obviously, you can imagine it would have been a hideous ordeal for all these horses. The ships would be packed with fast deteriorating quantities of feed, water, and obviously, it would have been, and the horses, there are references to horses being bled, enfeebled, to make them controllable, to make them tame, so that they were easier to put on the ship and easier to handle through the journey. Yeah, and there are all these references to South Indian rulers being so desperate for horses that they would pay merchants the price, at least half the price of the horse, based on the tails or the ears of these horses. So you can imagine that after those tails and ears were hacked off as proof, the bodies were thrown overboard, right? And across South Asia, South India, a lot of horse traders just simply migrated to India and they settled in India and they made a home of India, and we have a descendant of such personality.
This the term epic really encapsulates this so well, because just imagine herds of hundreds, if not thousands, of horses who are raised in the great ocean of grass that is Central Asia, being brought down by all these migratory communities to these bustling caravanserais full of different people of different ethnicities, and also traveling across the ocean. So every year you would have seen these massive fleets of ships with colorful sails coming in onto the west coast, then turning around the tip of the subcontinent, coming onto the east coast, and massive markets of people speaking Tamil, for example, arguing over the price of horses. And the example you gave, Yashaswini, of rulers paying for the tails of horses is actually from our very own Karnataka. So the Vijayanagara emperors desperately needed horses in order to
The Pandya also.
the Pandyas as well, yeah, the Pandyas and the Hoysalas, in fact. For many centuries, in fact, leading up to the advent of the Mughals in North India, South India was already interested in getting horses from abroad. One thing that I found very surprising about the depiction of the campaigns of Malik Kafur, the Delhi Sultanate general who came to South India, is that when he reached the Pandya country, one of the major objects of loot that he took back with him were horses.
Yeah. So that has to do with the Delhi Sultanate's policy of like scooping up all the horses and preventing its horses from falling into the hands of rival kings. So they'd also want to, sort of that. So it's completely plausible. And
The very
yeah,
fact that there were thousands of horses that these South Indian kingdoms had, and that he demanded them as tribute, so not just as a one-time payment, but also as a recurring thing,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
also says a lot about how interconnected
Yeah,
South India was.
because most of the trade in Arab Persian horses, for which there was a tremendous taste and demand, right, was through South India until the Mughals, and through, of course, also the ports of Gujarat. So the main ports through which the Mughals received the supply of Arab and Persian horses were through the ports of Gujarat and Sindh, Thatta as well. So yeah, you were talking about the journeys. I mean, Ibn Battuta describes a journey by a herd of horses, of 6,000 horses, all the way from the Eurasian steppes, so Russia effectively, near the, the Black Sea. They made a journey, all these horses, through from the Eurasian steppes through Central Asia into India.
I mean, just that just blows my mind to think of how interconnected Eurasia was by the early modern period. That people are essentially riding Central Asian, Russian horses, Arab horses, Persian horses. Um, but let's talk a little bit about the actual experience of these horses. Hasneen, I can imagine that horses that are bled and then put onto ships packed with a whole bunch of other horses in fairly unsanitary conditions, or even horses that are galloping all these thousands of miles, horses that are bred for leisurely riding or bred for war, don't necessarily hold up very well in journeys like this. So, how exactly do horses respond to this kind of treatment? And what kind of medical treatments were used for these horses in the early modern period?
Well, if horses were coming overland, so they would normally follow a relatively a route which would be fairly natural to them. So horses would travel from north to south in a sort of migration if they were feral animals. So they would follow the grass
No,
and
no,
they
but
would
these
go.
horses have been tamed.
Yeah. So in
These
any case, they'd
domesticated
be
horses.
following a sort of similar sort of route. So they'd be going south,
Yeah.
but even though it was an enforced march, and considering they were for sale, they would probably have been of a certain age. So they would have been, there wouldn't have been many stragglers, and they would have been able to herd them along fairly quickly. So overland, it would be probably as natural as possible for them to be transported. But the sea journey would have been something really horrific for them, because they would be packed cheek by jowl, and there would be 3 weeks minimum on a boat. And so you can imagine, the amount of refuse, the staining, the manure, the dung,
Was
the
thrown
urine.
overboard.
Yeah. So either they'd have to dock, or when they're so closely packed, they'll be bled to make them more manageable, but there would still be injuries, and there would, because because they've been kept tethered for so long, there would be colics, and because the unhealthy conditions, there would be, I would think there'd be a large number of respiratory infections that they would suffer, and that happens even today. It's not like it was something of the past, but even now, when you transport horses, it's a very, very big worry that they arrive safely, even under the best conditions of management. Sorry, better? So then the sea journey would have been horrific for them. And there would have been a lot of losses, or
Yeah.
considerable amount of losses.
There are lots of references to losses, and one of the reasons why these rulers had to be prepared to pay the full half price, if not the full price, on the basis of the tails or
Yeah.
years of horses is because they needed to incentivize this
Yeah.
trade. There was something I was going to ask you. What about seasickness? Because a horse can't vomit.
No, they can't vomit because of an anatomical, um, because of the soft palate, which is very long in the horse in particular. So like everybody has, because of the length of the soft palate, a horse can't sort of regurgitate whatever he's eating. But I don't think they have. There are no known. There are no known sort of in references to horses being seasick. So if they were sick, they would just be really dull, and and we wouldn't really know whether they were feeling queasy or not. But I mean, and when they would be treated, the methods of treatment at that time were really all possibly herbal, and things like ginger and things that I would be used for in respiratory infections, and turmeric would be used for wounds, but they would be very basic. Sometimes, when you read references of the treatment that used to go on at that time, you'd wonder how on earth did that animal survive. So,
One of the things that I found, one of the things that is still held up as a supposed proof that Indians didn't know how to raise horses is that in South India, especially in the Pandya kingdom, Marco Polo claims that horses were fed rice
Yeah.
and meat.
Well, that's difficult to believe that the horses were fed meat unless the meat was boiled and cooked to the extent that horse didn't even realize what it's eating. But the South Indians had a very bad reputation. Were not known for, according to the likes of Marco Polo, Abdullah Wasaf, this Iranian historian. I mean, they weren't really known for their horse sense. But because according to them all, there's such a high turnover rate because horses are constantly dying. Well, if horses were constantly dying, it's also because they had just suffered such a traumatic journey and arrived in India in a very enfeebled state, right? I found that very interesting that the overland journey, wouldn't have been that traumatic. The dangers in the case of the overland journey were different. Marauders, right? And also being the possibility of being trapped in mountain passes, or some horses being left behind in the desert, sort of stragglers, sort of falling by the wayside, getting left behind. So those were the kind of dangers that these horses suffered during the
overland.
overland journey. Yeah.
I find it strangely poetic that one of the origin stories, as it were, of the horse in India is this famous legend of the ocean being churned and the primeval horse or Chaisravas coming out of the
Yeah.
churning of the ocean.
Yeah.
And to think that the Indian Ocean is also the burial ground, as it were, of so many so many horses. Um, and so one way to get around the problem of like having to import horses from abroad, of course, is actually breeding them in India. And Indian horse breeds are not something that a lot of people generally know about, but both of you in your expansive experience must have interacted with Indian horse breeds. So can you tell us a little bit about the various breeds that are found across India and what they're like today?
Would you like to take that question?
Well, let me talk about the historical references, and then
Yeah.
perhaps you can discuss in what state they are at today. So, I mean, historically, like I said, there was definitely a preference for foreign and imported horses, but it's incorrect to think that horses weren't bred in India. There was something in the air of India that prevented horses from being bred. The rank and file of the Mughal army was mounted on Indian bred horses. I mean, a lot of the names that are used to describe these Indian breeds don't make a lot of sense, like Tazi, Jangla, Yabu, right? But Abul Fazl, the Mughal chronicler, also highlights certain parts of India as horse territories, where horses were bred in extensive numbers in herds. And broadly, there are one of the regions that he mentions are the Himalayan regions and the Himalayan foothills. And you do have these rather fantastic depictions of very distinctive looking horses. These Roman nosed horses from monasteries in the Western Himalayas. And the similar horses that look anatomically very similar are also seen in Eastern art. And it so happens that there are historical references to horses of Tibetan stock being imported, of Tibetan horses being imported through the Eastern Himalayas, through what is the Northeast, into Bihar, Bengal, being available throughout from the Western Himalayas to the Eastern Himalayas. And this is borne out by the paintings. And it's you can trace the ancestors of the modern breeds of the Spiti, Zanskar, Bhutia in such references. So that is one.
I just, if you can just pause for a second, because I really love that mural on the left.
That's fantastic.
It is just so lovely because you see these men who are in these beautiful checkered clothes and also have halos for some reason, who are evidently galloping with a couple of attendants as well. But what really strikes me is that these are evidently um, Tibetans, right? They're ethnically Tibetan, but they're wearing a costume, a turban, and this beard with a nice scimitar-shaped mustache that would not have been out of place in a 12th century North Indian court.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reflection of the extent to which Central Asian and Persianate culture passed into different parts of India.
Exactly.
And actually, it's debatable. The representation of the left mural is debatable. That could be a Kashmiri king or it could be a Western Himalayan king or a Western Tibetan king. But obviously, the courtly culture across the Western Himalayas was fairly uniform. And certainly, the same kind of horses were being ridden. And this king, surrounded by his entourage, are going hawking on horseback, and you have representations of hawking on horseback from across different Indian cultures. So it was clearly an established elite sport.
That is so fascinating. Even though we draw these borders between the history of South Asia and we say this is Pakistani history, this is Indian history, that's clearly not the case at all. There's this grand cultural complex with so many interacting people.
Yeah, so these, like I said, these horses of Tibetan stock were available in, from the western to the eastern Himalayas. There are references by foreign, and some of them, they were supposed to be so small actually, and they are distinguished between two groups, the Guns and the Tanghans. The Tanghans, according to a foreign traveler, was so small that the rider's feet would skim, would drag as he rode, right? And so that is one, and he compared them to the cobs, the English cobs, like hardy draft ponies. Then that's one region. Then the other region is Western India, so Rajasthan, Gujarat, such places. The ancestors of Kathiawadi, Marwadi horses. Marwadi is relatively recent nomenclature. I mean, a lot of traditional horse breeders will tell you that Marwadi horses used to simply be referred to as Desi horses or local horses once upon a time. As far as the Kathiawadi is concerned, I mean, since the ancient period, there are records of horses being bred in Gujarat. The Mughals, in Mughal records, there are references to Kachi horses. There was a tribe, the Kathi tribe of horse breeders, one of the few Indian communities that devoted itself or specialized in the business of breeding horses. I mean, Professor Tato from the Indian Institute of Science is here. He's done a lot of genetic research on Kathiawadi and Marwadi horses, and he told me that phylogenetically they seem to have been bred from Arab horses. And in fact, there are legends to that effect about local mares being bred with Arab horses to produce what became these distinctive Indian breeds. So that is one. So the Himalayas, Western India, the a lot of horses, a lot of Punjabi breeds are no longer found in India. They're extinct, but they're preserved in increasingly dwindling numbers in Pakistan. Then the final, of course, the great Deccan horse. By the 18th century, the Marathas, who gave the Mughals a run for their money in terms of cavalry warfare, they were breeding horses suited to the kind of battle tactics they practiced. So the Deccani or the Deccani horses or the Bhima ponies, but that's an extinct breed.
I think the lines have just got blurred between because of interbreeding.
Sorry?
The lines have just got blurred because of interbreeding. So
Yeah, so very few of these breeds are preserved in pure form. And this is actually one of the tragedies of not just Europeanization, when there were, the Europeanization of the horse culture of India and the colonial crackdown on a lot of horse breeding, horse trading communities, but also of historiography. In the sense, everybody would get fixated on those references, on those instances when Marco Polo or Vassar talk about how horses couldn't be bred in India, right? And so everybody is, so, to the extent that horses have been studied by modern scholars, there is a tendency just to like sit and fixate on that point that horses couldn't be bred in India. If horses couldn't be bred in India, there couldn't have been very many distinctive Indian breeds. Consequently, they've received very little attention, and they're very much on in the margins now. They're not part of the mainstream horse culture of India anymore.
Or the world just generally, Indian horse breeds don't seem to be as big a deal as compared to, say, Andalusian or Arab horses.
Actually, it's now the
Yeah, I
thoroughbred
think-
all the way.
Yeah, I think for the use of the Indian horse would be a much hardier breed of horse, which is acclimatized to Indian conditions, and who could be used in things like sport, like endurance and things like that. But apart from that sport, I can't see much use of that horse anymore. So for the progress, anything really to do with horses depended on how well they perform. So if a particular breed does well in a particular sport, then it gets bred to the exclusion of anything else. So for racing, you had Arabs racing. First there were the small little bhutias or those small ponies racing. Then you had the Arabs come in, and now the thoroughbred, because it is the fastest animal. So everything gets bred to the exclusion of that.
Yeah, because the horse, the horse is as marginal as it was once central, right? So when I refer to the horse scene of India, I'm referring to a very limited use of the horse by the horsey set. You know, that horse scene is a completely Europeanized one. The legacy, which has a certain colonial legacy, it's along international standards now. Whatever equestrian sports that were practiced in India in the pre-colonial times, or whatever ways in which horses were used and valued for the qualities for which they were valued, is something that's lost. With colonial intervention, with the change in taste for horses, so the sports that horses are now being bred for are European sports, even if some of them, like polo, were inspired by Indian forms. Like a modern polo is originally based on Manipuri polo, but it has been reinvented and standardized. So the horses that are being bred for modern polo, yeah, are along those international standards rather than any standards that might have been practiced historically in India.
That's a really fascinating point, actually, and I'm wondering if we can just take a second to talk a little bit more about the purposes for which horses are used in India today, this evolution of the horse scene, as it were, because we started out by talking about this very different culture where horses are seen as a mark of connoisseurship, where horses are purchased for leisure and also being purchased for war. But horses today are purchased for something very different, namely for the equestrian sporting scene.
Yeah, leisure, racing,
Sport,
yeah.
basically.
And the breeds that we see in India today are primarily European.
No, in places like Rajasthan, there are a lot of societies dedicated to preserving sort of the Marwadi breed. In Gujarat, there has been increased concern, but okay, let me say, the urban elite horse scene of India is Europeanized. It is based on international standards.
Interesting. The next thing I'd like to ask you both is, sorry.
Sorry, I was just saying, I was asking if he has any thoughts on the matter.
No, I think that's exactly it. I mean, as I was saying, that everything depends on how a horse performs. So if you're looking at say you're looking at a sport of, say, show jumping, then if you don't have the best show jumper, you will not be the best. Everything depends on the horse. It's 70% of any partnership. So it's now become a specific sport. So you have to have the best polo pony for you to have a good handicap. You have to have the best racehorse to win the best bigger races. So you're breeding specifically for something.
Interesting. You mentioned partnership, Hasnain, so let's talk a little bit more about partnership. Specifically, the bond between a rider and the horse, something that's been hinted at before. But can you tell us a little bit, not only about the bond between horses and the rider in history, but also about the bond between horses and riders today, as both of you are riders?
Asnan will have much better stories.
I'll leave it to
No, no, you tell us. But like, I mean, before I came for this event, I took my editor to meet my horse, Tista, and we went and had a look at a number of horses. We went from stable to stable, and I was very keen that she meet my horse because it's a very real thing. The book has turned out the way that it has because that emotive, that affective aspect was very important. I didn't want to take a prosaic approach by which a horse is seen only as a trade commodity or a war animal. But I wanted to bring out the historical partnership that enabled the age of the horse and how riders identify with certain horses, with individual horses, certain kinds of horses, and how that bond is very important. Trust me, a bond with a dog or a cat, no offense to cat or dog lovers, pales in comparison with a bond with a horse. Because, for example, historically, if you fought on horseback, the rider was as dependent on the animal, and which is why I've cited in a lot of stories about. There's this painting of Dil Pasand, beloved of my heart, Dara Shikoh's horse. He's identified as Dara Shikoh's horse. The Mughal prince chose to have a portrait of this horse painted by the master artist, right? So it's a reflection of the extent to which he identified with this particular horse. The horse was beloved to his heart, And I cite all these stories about Pabuji and Kesar Kalmi and how entire battles were fought over horses, right? Then Rana Pratap and Chetak, how Chetak is represented in the bardic literature, in the bardic lore of Rajasthan as an even greater Rajput than Rana Pratap, right? Who was valorized in Rajasthani history to a large extent for resisting Mughal rule, right? Then Shah Jahan obviously associated with a particular kind of horse. So then Ranjit Singh and Laili. I mean, then there's this wonderful story about Raju Singh, right? He had a favorite mare. The mare gets stolen, and he becomes like he shuns society and becomes a desert wandering ascetic. That it's very reminiscent of the Laila Majnu or such doomed romances, right? So that is the extent. It's a reflection of that bond. That emotional side was very important, you know. Um, but any, can you tell us any
Yeah,
famous
at any,
stories?
even today, at any sort of, I would, let me just restrict myself to high level competition or things like that. The rider and the horse have a great bond, and if they don't have that kind of a bond, it's very difficult to reach the levels of achievement that they do get to. So it is very, very important to know exactly how your horse feels that day, or if there's anything, if everything's okay or things not right. It's very, very important for them.
That's one thing that really stood out about the book for me is the fact that it is fundamentally a story of horses and people, and it's also about the interweaving of their emotional worlds. You're talking about all these profoundly human stories that really resonate with us today, of people who love their horses and who love being with horses, and perhaps even though the horses can't attest to it, horses that also love their riders. Um, so
So riders like to think that the horse is as devoted
I'm
to.
sure. Since you mentioned Chetak, Yashaswini, it's also a little personal to me because my father's first scooter was a Bajaj Chetak.
Okay.
So it's very obviously the Chetak is meant to represent a trusty steed up to this very day. I would like to move into audience questions in a few minutes, but before we do that, let's very briefly talk about what to me was the most fascinating part of the book, and that was the story of the horse and the Rajput. Rajasthan is so integral to the history of the horse in India. Rajputs to this day are considered to be these glorious knights and horse warriors, as it were. But you kind of demystify this and you really present this as a story of how the horse influenced the Rajput and the Rajput influenced the horse. And it's not just the Rajput in Rajasthan who engages with it, also many other different communities in Rajasthan whose histories were shaped by it. So can you quickly can you give us an overview of this aspect of the book?
So, like I said, I didn't want to write a purely elitist history of the horse, by which I only look at the elite side of that history. I only look in terms, I only examine the role of, say, horse warriors and polo players, or I only look at elite horses, the horses preferred by the elite, right? And I chose to make a case study of Rajasthan, because Rajasthan is considered horse territory and the Rajputs are considered horse warriors par excellence. And it's true that the horse informed the rise of the Rajputs as an elite class from about the 12th century onwards. The horse became quite central to Rajput identity. A lot of it is also has to do with the romanticization of Rajputs as these glorious horse warriors in the colonial period, mainly by James Todd, the great historian, colonial authority on Rajasthan. But I also talked about how social identities, not just elite identities, but even sort of lower status identities were formed around the horse. So a subcaste, a subcaste cobbler caste, the Zingar Mochis, were basically saddlers. It gave their association with the horse gave rise to a distinctive subcaste. Then the Bhils, a certain group of Bhils from Western Rajasthan began to specialize as grooms. They became known as Nayak Bhils. Again, so like even lower class, lower caste identities were formed around the horse. I mean, there was an industry surrounding horses at that point. So it wasn't just restricted to the rider. Then there were then sort of bardic communities, Charan and Bhat, bards of Rajput, of the elite Rajputs. They made the most of their special status, then the mobility that they enjoyed, and they became started to trade in horses. You have representations of Afghan horse traders in Rajasthan, right? Then you have this beautiful painting of the epic of Babuji, right? I mean, it's just to give you a very quick summary. It's about the rivalry between two Rajput lords. A Charan woman is central to it. Um, a, a, a woman from a certain Bardic community, the Charans, is central to it because she awards one of the Rajputs the prize horse, right? And it's an allusion to to the history of the Charan community as horse traders. These were nomadic pastoral communities. So obviously the history is neither as well recorded nor emphasized, highlighted like the history of the Rajputs. Yeah, but obviously horse traders enjoyed a very high status. The kind of access that they had to elite clientele was quite incredible, which is why you have all these presentation scenes. So I think that's pretty much it.
All right. So we're almost exactly on time. We have about half an hour for audience questions. So I'm really hoping we can get into aspects of the book that we weren't able to cover so far. So by any means, anybody who has any question, please raise your hands, and I will have a mic sent.
My two questions, since you are a historian, Ms. Chandra. Did Alexander the Great ride on a horse to come to India? That's the first question. And what kind of a horse he would have ridden if he has done that? Second, it's believed that the Mughals could conquer India, Babur and the rest of them, because they had superior horses. Is that a fact? These are two questions. Thank you.
What gave Mughal warfare an edge was their coordinated use of cavalry and firepower, right? So it was the combination of the two. All Central Asian armies had central contingents of mounted archers, and the heavy cavalry. But they also made use of gunpowder. So it was
Okay.
like combined, and all of these from behind field fortifications, right? So it was a combination of all these different tactics that gave Mughal warfare its edge.
Okay. And Alexander the Great?
Alexander, yeah, there's a legend of his horse, I forget his name.
Bucephalus.
Bucephalus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Alexander and Bucephalus are supposed to, the number of spots all over the Western Himalayas that are identified with the spot at which Bucephalus fell.
Bucephalus, yeah.
So, but is it a legend or is it a fact?
No, I think it's a fact.
It is.
It's a fact.
No, no. Is it a fact?
Bucephalus is fairly well
Yeah,
attested, I believe. I mean, there's some legends that seem a little extraordinary.
Yeah.
Apparently, Bucephalus was this uncontrollable stallion, and Alexander, who was a little kid at the time, was the only one who could tame him.
Yeah, there's
think he
stories
was-
like this about Akbar also. So there was one
Yeah.
particular horse that nobody could handle, Akbar alone. But whenever this horse would come, I mean, it would become as docile as a lamb in Akbar's company.
So even in that time, probably almost in BC, we could tame horse and people
Yeah,
could travel.
in fact, one of the reasons why Alexander was so successful was because the
Yeah,
Macedonians used cavalry very well in combination with infantry.
And their long spears. And actually, Bucephalus was afraid of his own shadow, which is
Oh.
something that
That's a legend.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a
So he
legend.
turned the horse towards the sun and then
There are all kinds of legends about this horse. But again, that is a reflection where it doesn't matter whether how much of it is fact and how much of it is fiction. But the fact that these legends developed around the horse became an alter ego of Alexander, is very telling of that bond that enabled the age of the horse,
All right.
pre-mechanization.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Can we take a question from Zoom, perhaps?
So I'm going to just combine two questions from Maya Ramaswamy and Karan Nagraj, who ask about references to horses in the Vedas or Indian religious texts, and things about the Ashwamedha Yajnas, for instance, and whether you could probably speak a little bit about that.
So I've talked about it in the book. The horse was obviously very important to the Indo-Aryans. The horse and the chariot with its spoked wheels is what helped the Indo-Aryans to spread very quickly across North India and establish themselves. The Rig Veda actually mentions the horse more than it does the cow. I'm almost. And the Ashwamedh Yag was like the ritual, the greatest, the supreme ritual performed by the greatest of kings to assert their sovereignty. I mean, it involved letting loose a consecrated animal, a white stallion, either a white stallion or a piebald. So there's been a taste for piebald horses in India all along. Yeah, the piebald horse was disparaged in many cultures, but in India there was a certain taste for it. A piebald horse or a horse with a midnight blue mane, so a specially chosen and consecrated animal would be let loose. It would be followed by a number of princes and warriors who had to guard it and prevent it. Defend its right to stray into the territory of any other king. And if the horse did that, if the stallion did that, then symbolically that king had to accept the suzerainty of the sacrificing king. And the Ashwamedh Yag culminated in the sacrifice of that animal, right? On a ground in a fairly, I mean, it sounds quite spectacular in a gory way. The ground had to be very specially prepared. A lot of animals had to be slaughtered. It had to be covered in the blood of of those animals, and ultimately the horse would be sacrificed. It was possibly strangled. But it was rare. It involved so many rituals and rules and regulations that it was quite rarely performed.
Okay, we have another question from Amal Sethi, who asks, how did you balance the story between the geopolitical historical narrative that needed to be told and the fact that the story was actually about horses? So do we take away lessons in history or lessons about horses in Indian history?
Tell me that question again.
So I think it's a little bit with about your writing process, and basically how you were balancing this story of the lives of actual horses and the fact that the book is also about the geopolitical historical narratives of the subcontinent.
Yeah, sadly, I mean, for all my affinity to horses, I can't speak for them. So I would have to be reborn a horse to write the true history of the horse. So what I thought would be the best possible way to do it is to write a history surrounding the horse, to look at the extent and the different ways in which the horse made its presence felt in Indian culture and society, and the influence that it had. You know, all the social structures that evolved around it, how its influence is seen in art, in folklore, in mythology. So that was my thinking, to write as comprehensive a survey as possible about the role of the horse in Indian history. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. We have any audience questions at this point? Yes, please.
First of all, what a wonderful pleasure it is to um, see the nice work that you've done. Yashaswini, congratulations.
Thank you,
And the
Professor.
man himself, Hasnain, whose family is connected with horse for generations in India. So, yeah, so I mean, what a great opportunity to actually go deep in the subject. You talked about the ancient part, the 5000 BC when Ashwamedha Yagna and all those took place. So, what I'm thinking about is we always talk about horses being brought to India, at different times. We talked about different breeds, 16th century, 17th century. You showed some wonderful pictures. What my mind is asking the question is it at all possible that horses may have originated in India? Is that a subject that you want to touch upon?
They can't have, I don't think that they could have originated in India. In fact, there seems to have been a long interlude since the native population of Indian horses disappeared in 8000 BCE, and until horses again began, the remains of horses, and horses sort of seem to make an appearance on the scene in the late Bronze Age, in the late Harappan period. The remains from that Any remains from that interlude are too limited to suggest that horses were extensively available, widely available or domesticated. There have been some recent findings, certain chariots that might have been drawn by horses have been excavated at Sonoli, that
Yeah,
might cast new light on the
yeah.
matter. But horses, I don't think would have originated in
Well,
India,
yeah,
though.
that's really what I'm thinking, that since there's such distinct description of horses in such a detailed manner in the scriptures, where did that actually, where was that inspired from? That's really what intrigues me. And then scientifically, again, if I may say so, I'm not, this is not a discussion, it's supposed to be a question, so pardon me for taking this longer, but scientifically, of course, people have discovered fossils of horses or ancestors of horses in India. That's again, they've been dated. So there is some evidence that what's called as Bacillodactyla, it's a, sorry for using this jargon, actually have been found in north of India. So yes, I mean, this is a question one cannot, but we should always keep that possibility in mind, given that, our scriptures talk about horses and you talked about such wonderful, but yeah, I think that really was what I wanted to bring in. But I think the passion with which you have described the culture, horse culture that existed in India, even before, equestrian sports became popular all over the world.
I'm so sorry.
So that's something that I really appreciate, and maybe we can discuss that
Yes,
during
thank you.
the intro. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
So we have, there's one thing that I really want to get into before we take another question, and that is Bangalore's own history as an equestrian city. Hasnain, can you please tell us a little bit about Bangalore as a horsey city, and also tell us a little bit about your family's involvement? You've been involved with horses for the last 6 generations. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Bangalore as a horsey city would probably, let me start with that first, because I think there's been a lot of horse activity around Bangalore, mainly because of the weather, and it's been, it's a sort of area where you can ride any time of the year. So, of course, during the colonial time, there were the Mysore Lancers was here, or probably even before that. Then the Mysore Lancers were here. So basically, they would provide for anything. Equestrian activity had to be, people would just either race horses together or race against each other. And there have been sort of reports of racing taking place in this area from 1820. Definite reports. So somebody raced a horse from, or they raced two horses from Alsur to Hoskote and back. So that was probably the earliest recorded racing. But there was a race course in the environs of Alsur. So racing has been taking place in India. And later you had polo. There were 3 polo grounds, at least 3 polo grounds that we know of. And then from there on, the Bangalore races have really developed and progressed. So yeah, the Bangalore's been probably pretty much a hub for equestrian activity in the south. And even now it is.
I should mention that when I spoke of all these over the centuries, a number of Arab Iranians, the sea trade and horses were in the hand, sort of began, was the sea trade, Arab and Iranian horse traders dominated came to dominate the sea trade and horses, but for the Portuguese interlude, when the Portuguese became dominant. And a number of merchants migrated to India and ended up settling. And one of the last great horse trader from Iran was Hassan's ancestor, Ali Ashkar, after whom a road is named. And Hassan's mother, Mrs. Saida Mirza, who's here, she's actually written a wonderful biography based on the family history on of Ali Ashkar. And incredibly, Hasnan's family, since Ali Ashkar set up shop in India, have been in the horse business. So he's very much part of the horsey history of Bangalore.
I guess it's something that's in the genes and you can't shake it off, but it's there. Fortunately, it continues. So, yeah, so as Ms. Ali Asghar came here in 1824 and basically traded in horses. And then they continued to be connected with racing, and his sort of descendants continue to be connected with the horses, some form of horse sport or racing right now, all the way down up to now. And we had, there were other illustrious members of the family, but I think mainly sort of connected with racing.
It's so fascinating to see that connection to the horsey stage. I guess for me to actually be sharing the same stage with you is quite fascinating. I think we have time for another 2 or 3 questions max. So can we take another question?
Yes. Okay. This one is from Srinivas Reddy, who says, fascinating talk. Could you speak about how the horse continues to be an elite animal today?
I have discussed the remnants of the traditional horse culture of India. I have talked about horse fairs that continue to date, whether it's Pushkar or it's Hola Mohalla in Anandpur. This culture is not what is so they do continue, and but it is disconnected from the mainstream urban elite horse culture, and that is an expensive sport. It is an expensive business. So to that extent, it is still, to the extent that it is still relevant, it is an elite animal, but there are so many different communities that still continue to depend on a horse. Until recently, potters in Rajasthan used to breed their own horses and use their horses to cart their wares. These horse fairs continue. There are, so I mean, yeah, I suppose in a way, the equestrian sports are an elitist business. There is no denying it.
Yeah, if you think that, in one area like Muxar in Punjab, there are almost 50,000 horses. in that area. So it's a large number of horses. And they use those horses to either race them on the road or race against each other, or some other sort of nihangs and
So
things
that,
like
yeah,
that. So
that does exist. Yeah,
that
yeah,
does exist.
yeah. So that association also exists. But it's interesting that you should say that. That elite connotation that continues to date is seen in terms of weddings. So you have these instances of Dalit bridegrooms to date being forced in backward North Indian parts, in backward parts of North India, being forced, being prevented from riding in their wedding processions on horses. I mean, that is a very stark manifestation of the elitism that has been associated with the animal.
That, and I think there was an incident of this happening just a few days ago. So it's something that's still very much present.
Yeah, so yeah, so the animal has been taken over by the upper caste. It's an upper caste animal, right?
Another question.
From Rituraj Kawaikar, is there any comparative account of the horses used by Marathas in the Third Battle of Panipat versus the cavalry of the Afghans?
Quite a bit of analysis has been done, and I've written about it also in the book. Again, it was a combination, the Afghan, yeah, so there has been a lot of research done. Afghan military tactics used to be, Maratha military tactics used to be slightly different. The Marathas rose to prominence practicing guerrilla tactics described as Baghigiris, which actually involved not confronting the opposing side in a pitched battle. But then, as the Maratha polity became more and more complex, they started adopting, they started having more diverse armies. The Afghans used certain kinds of guns that were very effective at the Third Battle of Panipat. There was less, considering the kind of battle tactics that the Marathas had practiced in the past, and the different kinds of armies that some other Maratha leaders started having. There was not a lot of coordinated action between them. So, I mean, there has been analysis, yes, of why the Afghans triumphed at the Third Battle of Panipat.
Another question from Ram Shende. If you could just talk about the history of the horseshoe and the stirrup.
Oh, so so there are ancient depictions of some sort of an element that looks like a stirrup but might not have been a true stirrup, because the true stirrup becomes introduced in India, and the use of it becomes extensive in India from about the 10th century, from about the 8th to the 10th century. And the horseshoe, yeah, the horseshoe is something, again, it's something that becomes, the horseshoe starts being used from about the 11th century. So yeah, these are later developments.
All right. Thank you all for joining us on this evening. We're almost at the end of our time today. Let me thank you once again, Yashaswini, not just for your fascinating book, but also for this fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope our audience have as well. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Hasneen.
Thank you very much.